I confessed to a crime I didn't commit to save my boyfriend from prison, spending 2 years behind bars while he promised to wait for me. Now he tells everyone that my criminal record destroyed his reputation and that I'm the worst mistake he ever made. The night that destroyed both our lives started like any other Friday evening in October, with Jake and his medical school friends celebrating the end of midterm exams at a bar near campus. I had been dating Jake for 8 months, long enough to be completely absorbed in his ambitious plans for becoming a surgeon, short enough to still feel grateful that someone so brilliant and driven had chosen me as his girlfriend. Before we get into the part that still hurts to tell, let us know where you're watching from and hit subscribe so you don't miss more deep, raw stories like this. Jake was everything I thought I wanted in a partner: intelligent, charming, destined for success in ways that made our future together seem bright and secure. He was in his second year of medical school, already talking about residency programs and specialty choices, painting pictures of the life we would build together once he established his career and could provide the kind of stability that his education promised. I worked as a paralegal at a small law firm, a job that paid decently but felt temporary compared to Jake's trajectory toward professional success and social status. Our relationship felt like my chance to be part of something bigger than my own modest ambitions, to support someone extraordinary through the challenging years of medical training that would eventually benefit us both. The call came at 2:47 a.m., Jake's voice shaking with panic and alcohol, explaining that something terrible had happened and he needed me to come immediately to an intersection about 10 miles from the bar where he had been celebrating. He couldn't provide coherent details through his tears and obvious intoxication, just desperate pleas for me to hurry and help him figure out what to do. I drove through empty streets with my heart racing, imagining scenarios that might require middle-of-the-night crisis management, but none that prepared me for what I found when I arrived at the location Jake had described. His car was wrapped around a telephone pole, front end crumpled beyond repair, airbag deployed, glass scattered across the asphalt like deadly confetti. Jake was standing beside the wreckage, visibly drunk and panicking, trying to explain through tears and slurred speech that he had hit someone while driving home from the bar. A cyclist who had been riding along the shoulder, someone who was now in an ambulance heading to the hospital with injuries that might be life-threatening depending on how quickly emergency medical care could address the trauma. The police hadn't arrived yet, Jake explained, because he had managed to call me before calling 911, hoping I could help him figure out how to handle the situation before law enforcement became involved. He was terrified about the consequences of drunk driving, especially the potential impact on his medical school enrollment and future career prospects that represented years of sacrifice and preparation. Jake's blood alcohol level was obviously well above the legal limit, his speech was slurred, his coordination was impaired, and his judgment was compromised by alcohol consumption that made rational decision-making impossible. A DUI conviction would likely result in jail time, license suspension, and academic consequences that could derail his medical education permanently. But more immediately, if the cyclist died from injuries sustained in the accident, Jake would be facing vehicular homicide charges that could result in decades in prison and complete destruction of any possibility for the future he had planned. Medical school would be over, surgical residency would be impossible, and the career that defined his identity and our shared goals would disappear entirely. Standing beside the wreckage in the cold October night, listening to sirens approaching in the distance, Jake begged me to help him avoid consequences that would destroy everything we had worked toward together. He couldn't think clearly enough to develop a plan, but he knew that a drunk driving conviction would end his medical career before it had truly begun. The solution came to me with frightening clarity as emergency vehicles arrived at the scene. I could claim to have been driving Jake's car when the accident occurred, that Jake had been the passenger, that I was the one responsible for the collision that had injured an innocent cyclist. My legal knowledge from working at the law firm helped me understand the implications, but my love for Jake made the decision feel inevitable. I had no professional reputation to protect, no career that required maintaining an unblemished record, no future that would be destroyed by criminal conviction. Jake's entire identity was built around becoming a doctor, while mine was built around supporting him through the process that would make that dream reality. The lie I told to responding police officers was simple and consistent. I had been driving because Jake had been drinking. The accident was my fault due to inexperience with his car and unfamiliarity with the road conditions. Jake was completely blameless and had actually been trying to convince me to let him drive despite his intoxication. Jake's relief when I took responsibility was immediate and overwhelming. his gratitude expressed through tears and promises about never forgetting my sacrifice, about making our shared future worth the temporary consequences I would face for protecting his career. He would support me through whatever legal proceedings resulted from my confession, would wait for me if imprisonment was necessary, would spend his life making up for what I was doing to save his dreams. The responding officers were initially skeptical about my claim to have been driving, noting that Jake appeared intoxicated while I was obviously sober, questioning why someone sober would allow someone drunk to be a passenger if safety was the primary concern. But my legal training helped me provide convincing explanations that gradually overcame their suspicions. Jake's car had sustained damage consistent with driver-side impact, which supported my story about being behind the wheel when the collision occurred. His injuries were minor and could have resulted from being a passenger during the accident. Most importantly, I was willing to submit to field sobriety testing that would demonstrate my sobriety while accepting responsibility for the collision. The cyclist survived the accident but sustained serious injuries that required multiple surgeries and months of rehabilitation, creating legal liability that would result in significant criminal charges regardless of who was actually driving. The severity of the consequences made my decision to accept responsibility feel both more necessary and more terrifying. Jake's promises during those first hours after the accident were comprehensive and heartfelt, covering everything from emotional support during legal proceedings to financial assistance with attorney fees to commitment about maintaining our relationship despite the challenges my sacrifice would create for both of us. He spoke about feeling guilty for allowing me to take responsibility for his mistake, about being unworthy of the sacrifice I was making, about spending the rest of his life proving that my love and protection had been deserved and appreciated. The accident was a wake-up call about his drinking and decision-making, he promised, a turning point that would make him worthy of the second chance I was providing. But even during those early hours when Jake's gratitude felt genuine and overwhelming, there were subtle signs that his appreciation was conditional on the sacrifice remaining private and temporary. He was concerned about how the situation might affect his reputation if classmates learned about the accident, worried about whether his medical school administration would become aware of his involvement even as a passenger. Jake's focus seemed to alternate between genuine remorse about the accident and strategic concern about managing its impact on his academic and professional prospects. The injured cyclist was mentioned primarily in terms of legal liability and potential consequences rather than human concern about someone whose life had been permanently altered by what had occurred. My own legal situation was immediately serious and complex, requiring criminal defense representation that would be expensive and time-consuming even if the case resolved favorably. The charges included reckless driving, vehicular assault, and potentially vehicular homicide if the cyclist's condition deteriorated, carrying possible sentences ranging from probation to several years in prison. Jake's promises about financial support for my legal defense were generous but vague, offered with genuine emotion but without specific commitments about amounts or timelines that would make budgeting and planning possible. His medical school expenses were already substantial, he explained, but he would do everything within his power to help cover the costs of protecting both our futures. The law firm where I worked was sympathetic about my situation initially, allowing time off for court appearances and legal consultations while maintaining my position during the early phases of criminal proceedings. But the publicity surrounding the case and the potential for extended absence due to imprisonment made my continued employment increasingly tenuous. Jake's medical school friends were supportive but distant, expressing sympathy for our situation, while avoiding too much association with legal troubles that might reflect poorly on their own professional reputations. The social circle that had included me as Jake's girlfriend began treating me differently once I became someone facing serious criminal charges. But Jake's continued commitment to our relationship during those first weeks felt like validation that my sacrifice was meaningful and appreciated, that the temporary consequences I faced were worth protecting the future we would build together once his career was established and my legal troubles were resolved. 3 weeks after the accident, as my attorney prepared for plea negotiations that would determine whether I faced trial or accepted responsibility through a guilty plea, Jake took my hands and promised that he would never forget what I was doing for him, that my love and sacrifice were the most important things anyone had ever done for him, that our future together would justify every difficult moment we were enduring. I believed those promises completely because I needed to believe them, because the alternative was acknowledging that I had destroyed my life to protect someone who might not deserve protection, because love felt impossible without trust that sacrifice would be appreciated rather than taken for granted. The night that changed everything had revealed who Jake was when faced with consequences for his actions, someone who would allow another person to absorb those consequences rather than accept responsibility himself. But I was too in love and too committed to the lie I had told to recognize that I was enabling someone whose character couldn't withstand the pressure of accountability. I thought I was saving the man I loved from a mistake that would destroy his future. I didn't understand that I was teaching him that mistakes could be transferred to other people, that consequences were negotiable, that love meant absorbing punishment for behavior you didn't choose. The legal proceedings that followed my confession were a masterclass in how thoroughly someone can destroy their life to protect someone else's lie. My attorney, a competent public defender who had seen enough cases to recognize fabricated testimony, spent weeks trying to convince me to reconsider my story before ultimately accepting that I was committed to maintaining the fiction that would send me to prison for someone else's crime. The evidence against my version of events was substantial and obvious to anyone with legal training. Jake's blood alcohol level, measured hours after the accident, was still significantly elevated despite the time that had passed since his last drink. The damage patterns on his car were consistent with someone of his height and build being behind the wheel. Most damning, surveillance footage from the bar showed Jake leaving alone, stumbling to his car, while I was clearly visible at my apartment complex 20 miles away at the time he claimed I had picked him up. But I maintained my story through police interviews, depositions, and preliminary hearings with the kind of consistency that comes from genuine commitment to a lie rather than confusion about facts. My legal training helped me anticipate questions and provide explanations that were implausible but not impossible, creating enough reasonable doubt about the timeline to make my confession legally viable. Jake's cooperation with my fabricated version of events was essential for maintaining the deception, and his performance during official proceedings was convincing enough to support my claims about his innocence. He testified with apparent reluctance about my decision to drive despite his protests, expressing guilt about allowing someone he cared about to take responsibility for an accident that had occurred while he was a passenger. His demeanor during court appearances was perfect, remorseful enough to seem genuine, protective enough to appear loyal, but distant enough to avoid seeming complicit in any deception. Jake had learned to present himself as someone who was reluctantly accepting my sacrifice rather than someone who had requested it, someone who was grateful but not responsible for my choice to confess. The plea bargain I eventually accepted included 2 years in state prison, 5 years probation, substantial fines and restitution to the victim, and a permanent felony conviction that would affect employment, housing, and social opportunities for the rest of my life. The sentence was lighter than what Jake would have faced if convicted of drunk driving and vehicular assault, but still severe enough to fundamentally alter the trajectory of my existence. Jake's promises about waiting for me during my incarceration were comprehensive and heartfelt during the weeks leading up to my sentencing. He would visit regularly, he assured me, maintaining our connection despite the physical separation. He would handle my financial obligations, keeping my apartment and belongings secure until my release. Most importantly, he would use the time to establish his medical career so that we could build the future together that my sacrifice was making possible. But the reality of my imprisonment was immediate isolation from everything and everyone I had known, while Jake's life continued with minimal disruption, beyond occasional visits and phone calls that became increasingly infrequent as months passed. Prison separated me from my job, my friends, my family, and my normal social connections, while Jake remained integrated in all the systems that defined his identity and prospects. The first month of visits was overwhelming emotional theater, with Jake expressing guilt about my situation, gratitude for my sacrifice, and commitment to our relationship that made the separation feel temporary and meaningful. He would update me about medical school, share plans for our future, and provide reassurance that my imprisonment was protecting something valuable that would benefit both of us eventually. But by the third month, Jake's visits had decreased from weekly to bi-weekly, with explanations about increased academic demands, clinical rotations, and study schedules that made regular prison visits difficult to accommodate. His phone calls became shorter and less frequent, focusing on practical updates rather than emotional connection or future planning. The changes in Jake's behavior were gradual enough to seem circumstantial rather than intentional, but the pattern was clear to anyone paying attention. As his medical school performance improved and his professional prospects solidified, his investment in maintaining connection with his incarcerated girlfriend decreased proportionally. My fellow inmates were skeptical about Jake's long-term commitment from the beginning, having witnessed countless similar situations where partners on the outside gradually distanced themselves from relationships that had become inconvenient or socially problematic. Their predictions about his eventual abandonment felt cruel initially, but proved increasingly accurate as his attention shifted toward opportunities that didn't require accommodation for my situation. The letters Jake wrote during my first year of imprisonment were loving but increasingly focused on his achievements and opportunities rather than our shared future or his appreciation for my sacrifice. Medical school honors, research opportunities, prestigious residency programs he was considering, his correspondence read like professional updates rather than romantic communication. More concerning was how Jake's description of social events and relationships began excluding any mention of me or our connection. He would write about parties, study groups, and clinical experiences as if he were single, avoiding references to having a girlfriend who was serving time for vehicular assault. The omission felt strategic rather than accidental. When I mentioned feeling forgotten or excluded from his social life, Jake's response was defensive irritation about my unrealistic expectations given our circumstances. He couldn't be expected to constantly reference our relationship in social situations where it might create awkward conversations or professional complications, he explained. Discretion was necessary for protecting both our interests. But Jake's discretion felt increasingly like denial of my existence rather than protection of our privacy. He was building relationships and professional connections that assumed he was available and unattached, creating a social reality that excluded me entirely rather than accommodating the temporary nature of our separation. The most devastating realization came during a visit 8 months into my sentence, when Jake mentioned casually that he had been accepted into a prestigious surgical residency program that would require him to relocate across the country immediately after my release. The opportunity was too important to decline, he explained, even though it would complicate our reunion and future planning. Jake presented this development as unfortunate timing rather than deliberate choice, but the implications were clear. He was prioritizing career advancement over relationship maintenance, choosing opportunities that would make our reunion difficult rather than seeking positions that would facilitate rebuilding our life together after my release. When I expressed concern about the geographical separation and its impact on our relationship, Jake's response revealed how completely his priorities had shifted during my incarceration. He seemed irritated by my expectation that his career decisions should accommodate our relationship, suggesting that such expectations were unrealistic given my criminal record and the complications it created for his professional reputation. The conversation that followed was devastating in its honesty about how Jake now viewed our relationship and my sacrifice. My imprisonment had given him time to reconsider whether our connection was worth the potential professional and social costs, whether associating with someone who had a felony conviction was compatible with his ambitions for surgical practice and social status. Jake's medical school colleagues and professors didn't know about our relationship or my situation, he explained, and introducing a girlfriend with a criminal record could create concerns about his judgment and character that might affect his career prospects. Professional reputation in medicine was crucial and fragile, requiring careful management of personal associations. The reframing of my sacrifice was subtle but complete. What I had done to protect Jake's career was now presented as something that threatened his career, a burden he was generously tolerating rather than a gift he should appreciate. My criminal record was his problem rather than his salvation, an obstacle to his success rather than the reason his success was possible. My imprisonment had also given Jake perspective on the relationship itself, he continued, helping him recognize that we had been moving too fast and making decisions based on emotion rather than practical compatibility. The accident and its aftermath had forced premature commitment that might not have developed naturally under normal circumstances. The subtext was clear. Jake was having second thoughts about our future together, using my imprisonment as an opportunity to distance himself from relationship obligations he had made under pressure rather than genuine desire. My sacrifice had bought him time to reconsider whether I was worth the investment I had demanded. But the most painful aspect of Jake's revised perspective was his growing resentment about the position my confession had placed him in professionally and socially. He felt obligated to maintain our relationship out of guilt about my sacrifice, trapped by my devotion rather than grateful for my protection. Jake's medical school success was thriving during my imprisonment, with academic achievements and professional opportunities that validated his decision to prioritize education over relationship maintenance. He was proving to himself that he could succeed independently, that his future didn't require the partnership I had thought we were building together. My own situation in prison was deteriorating as the reality of long-term incarceration without meaningful outside support became clear. The job I had lost was not waiting for my return. The apartment I couldn't afford to maintain had been terminated, my belongings sold or disposed of. The life I had sacrificed to protect Jake's future was disappearing entirely while his life expanded in new directions. Letters from family and friends became increasingly rare as people moved on with their lives and grew uncomfortable with maintaining relationships with someone serving time for violent crime. My social network contracted to fellow inmates and occasional contact with Jake, creating isolation that made prison feel like permanent rather than temporary separation from normal life. By the end of my first year in prison, Jake's visits had stopped entirely, replaced by brief phone calls that felt obligatory rather than loving. He was too busy with clinical rotations to make the drive to the correctional facility, he explained, but he would resume visits once his schedule allowed more flexibility. But the visits never resumed, and the phone calls became increasingly infrequent and superficial. Jake was building a life that excluded me systematically while maintaining just enough contact to avoid feeling guilty about complete abandonment. He was managing the situation rather than maintaining the relationship. 2 years into my sentence, Jake's communication was limited to occasional updates about his residency plans and generic expressions of support that felt copied from sympathy cards rather than written from personal connection. The man I had destroyed my life to protect was treating our relationship like a charitable obligation rather than a romantic partnership. The woman who had sacrificed everything to save Jake's medical career was learning that some people interpret rescue as burden, protection as debt, and love as inconvenience once the crisis has passed and normal life resumes. I was discovering that noble gestures can enable ignoble people, that taking responsibility for someone else's actions teaches them that responsibility is transferable, and that love without boundaries becomes martyrdom that inspires resentment rather than gratitude. But I still had 18 months left to serve, and Jake still had a medical career that existed because I had chosen prison over truth. My release from prison after serving 2 years felt less like freedom and more like exile to a world that had moved forward without me, while Jake had used that time to establish himself as a promising young doctor whose early mistakes had been erased by someone else's sacrifice. The job market that greeted me was hostile to applicants with felony convictions. The social landscape had shifted around relationships that no longer included me, and the boyfriend I had protected was increasingly embarrassed by the criminal record that had saved his career. The halfway house where I spent my first month of freedom was a harsh introduction to how thoroughly my sacrifice had damaged my prospects for rebuilding a normal life. Employment applications that asked about criminal history eliminated me from consideration before interviews. Housing applications that required background checks resulted in immediate rejections, and social situations became exercises in managing other people's discomfort with my conviction for vehicular assault. Jake's reaction to my release was complicated by his awareness that my presence in his life now represented a potential threat to the reputation he had carefully cultivated during my incarceration. The medical residency he had accepted was prestigious and competitive, requiring association with colleagues and superiors who expected their residents to demonstrate excellent judgment in both professional and personal relationships. My criminal record was no longer Jake's salvation, but his liability, evidence of poor decision-making in romantic partners that could affect how attending physicians and program directors viewed his character and reliability. The woman who had saved his career was now potentially capable of damaging it simply through association. Jake's apartment had been transformed during my imprisonment into the living space of someone single and professionally focused, with no evidence of our relationship or reminders of the sacrifice I had made to protect his future. Medical journals, anatomical models, and prestigious awards replaced the photographs and personal items that had once reflected our shared life and plans. When I mentioned the absence of our shared history from his living space, Jake's explanation was practical rather than romantic. Professional colleagues occasionally visited for study sessions or social gatherings, he explained, and maintaining evidence of a relationship with someone who had a felony conviction could create awkward questions or concerns about his judgment. The reframing of our relationship as potential professional liability rather than personal partnership was swift and comprehensive. Jake had learned to view my presence in his life through the lens of career management rather than emotional connection, calculating the costs and benefits of maintaining association with someone whose background could complicate his advancement. My employment search was a daily reminder of how thoroughly my sacrifice had limited my future opportunities. The legal field where I had worked before prison was largely closed to applicants with criminal convictions, especially those involving violence. Administrative positions, retail work, and service industry jobs that might have been available to someone with my background were competitive and poorly paid. The financial consequences of my imprisonment were devastating and ongoing. 2 years without income had eliminated my savings, destroyed my credit, and created debt that would take years to resolve even with steady employment. Meanwhile, Jake's earning potential had increased dramatically through his medical training, creating a gap between our financial circumstances that made our previously balanced relationship feel fundamentally altered. Jake's discomfort with my employment struggles was obvious and defensive, as if my difficulty finding work reflected poorly on his success rather than representing the natural consequence of my sacrifice for his benefit. He offered generic encouragement about persistence and optimism while avoiding specific assistance that might have addressed the practical obstacles I faced. When I suggested that Jake could provide references or networking connections that might help overcome employer reluctance to hire someone with a criminal record, his response was immediate anxiety about potential professional consequences of associating his reputation with my background. Medical colleagues couldn't be expected to overlook criminal convictions in favor of personal recommendations, he explained. But Jake's reluctance to assist with my employment search revealed how completely he had separated my well-being from his own interests during my incarceration. The interdependence that had once characterized our relationship had been replaced by strategic distance that protected his advancement while leaving me to manage the consequences of protecting him independently. My family's reaction to my relationship with Jake had evolved from supportive understanding to concerned questioning during my imprisonment, and my release intensified their criticism of his behavior and my continued commitment to someone who was obviously distancing himself from our connection. My sister Emma was particularly direct about Jake's failure to provide meaningful support during my incarceration or assistance with reintegration after release. She could see that I was struggling with basic necessities while Jake enjoyed the career success that my sacrifice had made possible, pointing out the fundamental inequity in how our shared crisis had affected our respective circumstances. But defending Jake had become habitual after 2 years of maintaining the lie that had sent me to prison, and acknowledging his selfishness would have required admitting that my sacrifice had been wasted on someone who didn't deserve protection. The alternative was accepting that I had destroyed my life to enable someone whose character couldn't withstand accountability. Jake's social life had expanded during my incarceration to include colleagues and friends who knew nothing about our relationship or the circumstances that had launched his medical career. These relationships were built on the assumption that he was single and available, creating social dynamics that excluded me systematically rather than temporarily. When I expressed interest in meeting Jake's new friends or participating in social activities that had become important to him, his response was uncomfortable deflection about the complexity of introducing someone with my background to professional colleagues who might not understand our situation or the circumstances that had led to my conviction. The message was clear: Jake was ashamed of our relationship and my criminal record, viewing both as obstacles to the social acceptance and professional advancement that had become more important than our shared history. I had become someone to be managed rather than someone to be celebrated, a complication rather than a partner. My parole requirements included regular meetings with a supervision officer, community service obligations, and restrictions on travel and activities that made normal relationship maintenance difficult even when Jake was willing to accommodate the challenges. The criminal justice system's ongoing oversight of my life created additional barriers to rebuilding our connection. But Jake's impatience with these requirements revealed his fundamental misunderstanding of what my sacrifice had actually cost and continued to cost in practical terms. He seemed to expect that my release from prison would immediately restore our relationship to its previous dynamic, without acknowledging the ongoing consequences of the conviction I had accepted to protect him. The most painful conversations occurred when Jake would express frustration about how my situation was affecting his life and prospects, as if my criminal record were something that had happened to me independently rather than something I had chosen to protect his future. The sacrifice had been reframed as personal failing rather than romantic devotion. Jake's medical training had provided him with sophisticated language for discussing psychological and social dynamics, and he began using clinical concepts to analyze our relationship problems in ways that positioned my expectations as unhealthy rather than reasonable. I was being possessive about his time, manipulative about his social obligations, and unrealistic about his professional requirements. The therapeutic reframing was effective because it made disagreement with Jake's priorities seem like evidence of psychological problems rather than legitimate relationship concerns. If I objected to being excluded from his social life, I was being controlling. If I requested practical support, I was being dependent. If I mentioned my sacrifice, I was being manipulative. But the most devastating aspect of Jake's revised perspective on our relationship was his growing belief that my confession had been selfish rather than selfless, motivated by desire for control and drama rather than love and protection. He had begun to question whether I had actually believed he was driving or whether I had seized an opportunity to create a situation where he would be permanently indebted to me. The reinterpretation of my motives was particularly cruel because it reversed the moral dynamics of our shared crisis, making me the manipulator rather than the martyr, the person who had created problems rather than solved them. Jake was discovering that viewing me as calculating rather than loving made his treatment of me feel justified rather than ungrateful. My attempts to remind Jake of his promises about our future together and his gratitude for my sacrifice were met with irritation about my inability to move forward rather than recognition of his failure to honor commitments made during his crisis. The past was something to be overcome rather than acknowledged, a burden rather than a foundation. 6 months after my release, Jake's communication with me had become sporadic and superficial, limited to brief text messages and occasional phone calls that felt obligatory rather than loving. He was managing our relationship like a professional obligation rather than maintaining it as a romantic partnership. The medical residency that had seemed like an unfortunate complication to our reunion was clearly a deliberate choice that would make maintaining our relationship difficult while providing Jake with geographical and social distance from the sacrifice I had made for his benefit. He was building a new life that excluded me systematically while avoiding direct confrontation about ending our relationship. But the most profound realization was understanding that Jake's resentment about my sacrifice was genuine rather than strategic. He truly believed that my conviction had become a burden for him to bear rather than a gift for him to appreciate, that my criminal record was threatening his success rather than enabling it. The noble lie I had told to protect someone I loved had taught him that consequences were transferable, that accountability was optional, and that other people's devotion could be exploited without reciprocal obligation. My sacrifice had enabled someone whose character was fundamentally incompatible with genuine gratitude or commitment. I was learning that some people interpret rescue as weakness rather than strength, protection as manipulation rather than love, and sacrifice as strategy rather than devotion. Jake had convinced himself that I was the problem rather than the solution, the burden rather than the blessing, the mistake rather than the miracle. The woman who had chosen prison to save her boyfriend's future was discovering that noble gestures often enable ignoble people, that taking blame for someone else's actions teaches them that blame is transferable, and that love without boundaries becomes martyrdom that inspires resentment rather than gratitude. Jake's acceptance into the surgical residency program at Johns Hopkins represented the pinnacle of achievement that my sacrifice had made possible, but his celebration was overshadowed by anxiety about how my criminal record might affect his professional reputation if anyone discovered our connection. The woman who had gone to prison to protect his medical career was now seen as a threat to the very career she had saved. The residency program was extraordinarily competitive and prestigious, accepting only the most promising medical students whose backgrounds demonstrated exceptional judgment and character. Jake's acceptance validated everything we had hoped my sacrifice would accomplish, but his excitement was tempered by concern about maintaining the pristine reputation that such opportunities required. During the weeks leading up to his move to Baltimore, Jake became increasingly explicit about his expectation that our relationship remain completely private to protect his professional standing. He couldn't risk having colleagues, supervisors, or other residents learn about his association with someone who had a felony conviction for vehicular assault, regardless of the circumstances that had led to that conviction. The demand for secrecy felt like the ultimate betrayal of everything I had endured to protect him. For 2 years in prison, I had sustained myself with the belief that Jake was grateful for my sacrifice and proud of the love that had motivated it. Now I was learning that he was ashamed of both the sacrifice and the person who had made it. Jake's explanation for why our relationship needed to remain hidden was clinical and strategic, focusing on the realities of professional advancement in competitive medical fields where reputation and perception were crucial for success. Personal associations reflected on professional judgment, he explained, and any connection to criminal activity could raise questions about character that might affect his career trajectory permanently. But the practical implications of Jake's demand were devastating and comprehensive. I couldn't visit him in Baltimore, couldn't meet his colleagues or friends, couldn't participate in social events or professional gatherings that were becoming central to his life. Our relationship would exist only in private phone calls and text messages, invisible to everyone who mattered in Jake's expanding professional world. When I refused to accept complete invisibility in Jake's life, his reaction was explosive anger about my selfishness and inability to understand the sacrifices required for medical career advancement. He accused me of trying to sabotage his success after everything he had endured to support me through my legal troubles and imprisonment. The role reversal was swift and complete. Jake had rewritten our history to position himself as the person who had sacrificed to support me rather than the person who had been supported through my sacrifice. My refusal to disappear entirely from his life was evidence of my selfishness rather than reasonable expectation of partnership. Jake's anger revealed the depth of his resentment about the position my confession had created for him professionally and socially. He felt trapped by obligation to maintain our relationship when it had become inconvenient and potentially damaging to his reputation, forced to accommodate someone whose background could complicate his advancement. But the most devastating aspect of Jake's revised perspective was his genuine belief that my sacrifice had been motivated by manipulation rather than love, designed to create permanent indebtedness rather than protect his future. He had convinced himself that I was controlling and calculating rather than devoted and selfless. The reinterpretation of my motives allowed Jake to feel justified in his treatment of me rather than guilty about his ingratitude. If my confession had been strategic manipulation rather than romantic sacrifice, then his resentment was appropriate rather than cruel, his distance was self-protection rather than abandonment. Jake began describing our relationship to mutual friends and family members in ways that positioned me as the problematic partner who had created complications in his life rather than solved them. My criminal record was evidence of poor judgment rather than noble sacrifice. My expectations were unreasonable demands rather than legitimate relationship needs. The narrative Jake constructed was sophisticated and convincing because it contained elements of truth presented in misleading ways. I did have a criminal record that could affect his reputation. I was struggling with employment and financial stability that created dependency. I was requesting support and accommodation that required sacrifice from him. But Jake's version omitted the crucial context that explained these circumstances, that my criminal record existed because I had protected him from consequences of his own actions, that my struggles were direct results of sacrificing my future for his benefit, that my requests were for reciprocal support after years of comprehensive sacrifice. The friends who accepted Jake's revised version of our relationship history were responding to partial information that made his behavior seem reasonable rather than recognizing the complete picture that revealed his ingratitude and selfishness. They saw someone trying to advance his career despite complications created by a problematic partner rather than someone abandoning the person who had saved his career. My attempts to provide alternative perspectives on our relationship dynamics were dismissed as desperate attempts to manipulate situations through guilt and emotional pressure. Any reference to my sacrifice was interpreted as evidence of the controlling behavior Jake had described, proof that I was using my prison experience to coerce compliance with my demands. The impossible situation was that defending myself validated Jake's accusations about my manipulative tendencies, while remaining silent allowed his narrative to become accepted truth among people who mattered to both of us. There was no response that wouldn't confirm his reframing of our relationship as problematic rather than protective. Jake's medical school friends who had witnessed my arrest and trial were particularly susceptible to his revised interpretation because they had never understood why someone would confess to a crime they didn't commit unless the confession served manipulative purposes. My sacrifice had always seemed suspicious to people who couldn't imagine making similar choices for romantic reasons. The professional success Jake achieved during his residency was accompanied by increasing confidence about his right to distance himself from relationships that complicated his advancement. He was learning that his career prospects were more important than personal obligations, that professional achievement justified personal selfishness. But Jake's success was entirely dependent on the sacrifice I had made to protect him from consequences that would have ended his medical career before it began. Every achievement, every recognition, every opportunity was built on the foundation of my destroyed reputation and criminal record. The irony was profound but invisible to most observers. Jake's medical career was thriving because someone else had absorbed the consequences of his drunk driving, but he was presenting that same person as a threat to the career she had saved through comprehensive self-sacrifice. My employment situation remained precarious and limited by the criminal record I had accepted to protect Jake's prospects, creating financial stress that made independence difficult while he enjoyed the financial security that medical residency provided. The gap between our circumstances was a direct result of choices made to benefit him at my expense. When I requested practical assistance with employment searches or financial obligations, Jake's response was immediate defensiveness about his own financial responsibilities and concern about how providing support might create additional obligation or dependency that could complicate his professional advancement. The refusal to provide assistance felt particularly cruel because Jake's financial stability existed only because I had prevented the legal consequences that would have eliminated his earning potential entirely. He was protecting resources that existed because of my sacrifice while refusing to share those resources with the person who had made them possible. Jake's new colleagues and supervisors at Johns Hopkins knew nothing about our relationship or the circumstances that had enabled his medical education to continue uninterrupted. They saw someone with excellent academic credentials and promising surgical skills rather than someone whose career had been saved through another person's comprehensive sacrifice. The professional validation Jake received from respected physicians and competitive colleagues reinforced his belief that his success was merited through individual achievement rather than enabled through external protection. He was earning recognition that felt authentic because it ignored the foundation that had made it possible. But the most devastating realization was understanding that Jake had genuinely convinced himself that my presence in his life was harmful rather than helpful, that my love was dangerous rather than devoted, that my sacrifice had been selfish rather than selfless. The psychological transformation was complete and apparently irreversible. Jake had rewritten our shared history so thoroughly that he believed his revised version more than the actual events we had lived through together. I had become the villain in his personal narrative rather than the hero of his professional success. The conversation that ended our relationship was brief and definitive, with Jake explaining that he needed to focus on his medical training without the complications that our connection created for his professional development. He wished me well in rebuilding my life, but couldn't continue accommodating someone whose background and expectations were incompatible with his career goals. The breakup was presented as mutual recognition of incompatibility rather than abandonment of someone who had sacrificed everything for his benefit. Jake had learned to frame his selfishness as practical decision-making, his ingratitude as professional necessity, his cruelty as mature boundary setting. Standing in my shabby apartment, listening to Jake explain why the person who had gone to prison to protect his future was now an obstacle to that future, I finally understood the complete scope of what had happened. I had enabled someone whose character was fundamentally incompatible with gratitude, whose success required erasing the person who had made it possible. The noble lie I had told to protect someone I loved had taught him that love was exploitation, sacrifice was manipulation, and devotion was strategy for control. My protection had enabled someone who would eventually need protection from me. Jake's medical career was flourishing because I had absorbed consequences that belonged to him, but his success required forgetting that absorption had occurred. The woman who had saved his future had become the enemy of that future, the protector had become the person he needed protection from. I had learned that some people interpret rescue as weakness, gratitude as burden, and love as liability when it becomes inconvenient. The person I had protected from consequences was now protecting himself from the person who had provided that protection. 2 years after Jake ended our relationship to protect his medical career, I was working as a night shift security guard at a medical supply warehouse when I overheard his voice on a radio interview about promising young surgeons making a difference in their communities. He spoke eloquently about overcoming challenges and poor influences in his past, about learning to make better choices in relationships and professional associations, about the importance of surrounding yourself with people who support your growth rather than hold you back. The irony of Jake describing me as a poor influence while speaking on a radio show made possible by the career I had saved was devastating but not surprising. He had successfully rewritten our history to position himself as someone who had overcome toxic relationships rather than someone who had been rescued by comprehensive sacrifice from someone who loved him. Jake's new narrative about our relationship had evolved during the years since our breakup into a sophisticated story of personal growth and learning to recognize unhealthy relationship patterns. According to his version of events, I had been a manipulative partner who had used criminal behavior to create drama and control in our relationship, someone he had eventually recognized as toxic and removed from his life. The criminal record that existed because I had protected Jake from drunk driving consequences was now presented as evidence of my inherently problematic character rather than proof of my willingness to sacrifice everything for his benefit. My conviction for vehicular assault was his example of the kind of person ambitious professionals needed to avoid for their own protection. Jake's colleagues and friends who knew about our past relationship through his selective disclosure saw me as someone who had dragged him down during his early medical training, a cautionary tale about how romantic partners with criminal backgrounds could threaten promising careers. They admired his strength in ending the relationship and focusing on his professional development. But the most devastating aspect of Jake's revised narrative was how it had been embraced by mutual friends and family members who found his version more palatable than the complex reality of what had actually happened between us. Supporting someone who claimed to have escaped a toxic relationship felt morally clear in ways that examining the nuances of sacrifice and ingratitude did not. My own reputation in social circles that had once included both of us was permanently damaged by Jake's strategic disclosure of selected facts about our relationship. People knew that I had a criminal record and that Jake had ended our relationship because of concerns about my character, but they didn't know that the criminal record existed because I had protected him from consequences of his own actions. The professional consequences of my criminal conviction continued to limit employment opportunities and social advancement in ways that created ongoing financial and emotional stress. Meanwhile, Jake's medical career was thriving with achievements and recognition that were built on the foundation of my destroyed prospects. Jake's success as a surgeon was generating local media attention and professional accolades that celebrated his skill, dedication, and character. Articles about his work included biographical information about overcoming early challenges and making mature decisions about personal relationships that had supported his professional development. The public recognition Jake received for his medical achievements was accompanied by speaking engagements and community involvement that positioned him as a role model for young professionals. His story of success despite early obstacles was inspiring to audiences who didn't know that the obstacles had been removed through someone else's sacrifice. But Jake's public persona as someone who had overcome poor relationship choices to achieve professional success required the continued existence of me as the poor choice he had overcome. His inspiring narrative about personal growth depended on maintaining the fiction that I had been harmful rather than helpful to his development. The legal impossibility of recanting my confession without destroying both our lives meant that the truth about our relationship and my sacrifice would remain permanently hidden. Any attempt to reveal that Jake had been driving during the accident would expose both of us to perjury charges and potentially void the plea agreement that had resolved the case. I was trapped in a situation where the truth about my sacrifice couldn't be disclosed without legal consequences that would destroy whatever life I had managed to rebuild after prison. The lie I had told to protect Jake had become a permanent barrier to defending myself against his accusations about my character. My attempts to correct misunderstandings about our relationship among mutual friends were dismissed as desperate efforts to damage Jake's reputation out of jealousy about his success. Any defense I offered was interpreted as evidence of the manipulative behavior he had described, proof that ending our relationship had been necessary for his well-being. The social isolation that resulted from Jake's narrative about our relationship was profound and ongoing. Friends who had once valued my judgment and character now viewed me with suspicion and concern, seeing potential manipulation in normal social interactions because they had been primed to expect problematic behavior. Dating became nearly impossible because potential partners would eventually learn about my criminal record and the circumstances that had led to it according to Jake's version of events. Men who might have been willing to overlook a vehicular assault conviction were less interested in someone who supposedly used criminal behavior to manipulate romantic relationships. The few serious relationships I attempted were affected by partners' awareness of allegations about my past behavior, with conversations about relationship dynamics, often including implicit references to manipulation tactics that supposedly characterized my previous relationship with Jake. But the most painful aspect of Jake's success was watching him receive recognition for character and integrity while building that reputation on a foundation of ingratitude and historical revision. He was celebrated for qualities he didn't possess, while the person who had demonstrated those qualities through sacrifice was dismissed as someone who lacked them entirely. Jake's medical practice was thriving with patient testimonials and professional recognition that celebrated his skill and dedication. The surgical training he had completed at Johns Hopkins had led to a prestigious position at a major hospital where his work was making a genuine difference in patients' lives. The success Jake achieved was meaningful and deserved based on his medical skills and professional commitment, but it was success that existed only because someone else had absorbed consequences that would have ended his career before it began. Every life he saved as a surgeon was made possible by the life I had sacrificed to protect his opportunity to save lives. My own career prospects remained limited by the criminal record I had accepted to protect Jake's future, creating a permanent barrier to professional advancement that affected every aspect of my life. The legal field where I had worked before prison remained largely closed to applicants with felony convictions, forcing me into service industry work that provided survival income but no prospect for advancement. The financial consequences of my sacrifice were ongoing and cumulative, affecting not just current income but long-term financial security through limited career prospects, poor credit from imprisonment, and restricted access to educational opportunities that might have improved my situation. Jake's financial success as a surgeon was accompanied by social status and professional recognition that opened doors to opportunities I could never access with a criminal background. The gap between our circumstances was a direct result of choices made to benefit him at my expense, but he presented his success as evidence of superior character rather than enabled privilege. The most devastating realization was understanding that Jake had genuinely convinced himself that his success was entirely merited through individual effort rather than enabled through external sacrifice. He had rewritten our history so completely that he believed his achievements were independent of my protection. Jake's speaking engagements about professional development and personal growth included advice about choosing supportive relationships and avoiding people who might hold you back from achieving your potential. The irony of someone whose potential had been protected through comprehensive sacrifice advising others to avoid supportive people was cruel but invisible to audiences who didn't know the truth. The woman who had gone to prison to save Jake's medical career was now his example of the kind of person ambitious professionals needed to recognize and avoid. My love had become his cautionary tale, my sacrifice had become his example of poor judgment, my devotion had become his evidence of toxic behavior. But Jake's transformation of our relationship into a story of personal growth and better decision-making served multiple psychological functions that made it more appealing than acknowledging the reality of my genuine sacrifice. Casting me as toxic allowed him to avoid examining his own ingratitude, justified his abandonment of someone who had loved him, and positioned his success as deserved rather than enabled. The professional validation Jake received from colleagues and patients reinforced his belief that his achievements were merited through individual character rather than protected through external sacrifice. He was earning recognition that felt authentic because it ignored the foundation that had made it possible. 2 years after our breakup, Jake had successfully constructed an alternative version of our relationship that served his emotional needs while destroying my reputation and social connections. The comprehensive sacrifice I had made was remembered as comprehensive manipulation. The protection I had provided was reframed as the toxicity he had escaped. The person who had confessed to a crime she didn't commit to save her boyfriend's future was now the criminal he had courageously removed from his life. The safe haven I had provided through sacrifice had been reconstructed as the danger he had escaped through wisdom. Jake's new life was built on the foundation of my supposed toxicity, his strength measured by his ability to overcome my alleged manipulation, his success defined by his distance from the relationship where I had supposedly held him back through selfishness disguised as love. But the most cruel irony was that Jake's transformation into someone who could recognize and resist toxic relationships had been enabled by the very relationship he now described as toxic. The independence he celebrated had been purchased with someone else's freedom. The success he enjoyed had been protected through someone else's sacrifice. The man who was teaching others about healthy relationships had learned those concepts through a relationship with someone who had given up everything to protect his future. The success story he told about overcoming poor influences was actually a story about abandoning the person whose influence had made his success possible. 5 years after I was released from prison, I was sitting in a coffee shop when I overheard a conversation between two medical students discussing their role model, Dr. Jake Morrison, whose inspiring story of overcoming a toxic relationship and criminal associations during medical school had become legendary in their program. According to their understanding, Jake had nearly been derailed by a manipulative girlfriend who had committed vehicular assault and tried to drag him down with her criminal behavior before he found the strength to end the relationship and focus on his career. The conversation was surreal in its complete inversion of reality. These students were discussing Jake as someone who had shown remarkable character in distancing himself from criminal influences, praising his wisdom and recognizing that some people will use any tactic, including legal troubles, to manipulate and control their partners. My sacrifice to protect his future had been transformed into evidence of my manipulative nature. Jake's reputation at the medical school had evolved into something approaching folklore. The brilliant student who had nearly been destroyed by a toxic relationship, but who had found the strength to prioritize his career and moral integrity over misguided loyalty to someone who was clearly bad for his future. His story was used to counsel other students about the importance of maintaining high standards in personal relationships. The medical students discussing Jake's inspiring example knew that he had once been involved with someone who had been convicted of vehicular assault, but they understood this involvement as evidence of his compassion and naivety rather than his culpability. Jake had tried to help a troubled person, they believed, only to learn that some people are beyond help and will drag down anyone who tries to assist them. Jake's current position as chief resident at a prestigious hospital was accompanied by recognition for his leadership, clinical skills, and ethical standards that made him a natural mentor for younger medical professionals. His colleagues and supervisors viewed him as someone whose character had been tested and proven through difficult personal experiences during his training. But the most devastating aspect of overhearing that conversation was realizing how completely Jake had succeeded in rewriting our history for professional advantage. The criminal record that existed because I had protected him from drunk driving consequences was now his evidence of the kind of person medical professionals needed to recognize and avoid for their own protection. Jake's marriage to another physician had received coverage in the hospital newsletter, with articles celebrating the union of two dedicated medical professionals whose shared commitment to healing and ethical practice made them role models for the medical community. The wedding photos showed a couple whose success was built on mutual support and shared values. His new wife's background was everything mine wasn't: prestigious medical education, unblemished legal record, family connections in the medical field, and social status that enhanced rather than threatened Jake's professional reputation. She represented the kind of partner who supported ambitious medical careers rather than creating complications that required management. The contrast between Jake's current marriage and our previous relationship was stark and obviously intentional. Where I had been someone whose criminal record could damage his reputation, she was someone whose credentials enhanced his standing. Where I had required accommodation and support, she provided mutual professional advancement. Where I had represented risk, she represented security. Jake's social media presence during this period showcased a life of professional achievement and personal fulfillment that made no reference to the sacrifice that had made his success possible. Photos of surgical procedures, medical conferences, and social events with colleagues presented someone whose achievements were entirely self-generated rather than enabled through external protection. But the most painful discovery was learning that Jake had incorporated his version of our relationship into his professional development activities, speaking to medical students and residents about recognizing unhealthy relationships and maintaining professional integrity despite personal challenges. According to colleagues who attended these presentations, Jake would discuss the importance of choosing partners who supported professional growth rather than creating obstacles, who shared ethical values rather than demonstrating concerning judgment, who enhanced rather than threatened career prospects through their own character and choices. The presentations were apparently well received and considered valuable professional development, with Jake being recognized for his willingness to share personal experiences that could help others avoid similar challenges. His openness about having once been involved with someone who had criminal behavior was seen as evidence of his integrity and commitment to helping others. But Jake's professional presentations about avoiding toxic relationships were built on a foundation of complete historical inversion. He was teaching others to recognize manipulation tactics that he claimed to have experienced but had actually employed, warning about people who would sacrifice others for personal gain while describing someone who had sacrificed herself for his gain. The expertise Jake displayed in recognizing unhealthy relationship patterns was genuine, but derived from having created those patterns rather than experienced them. He could identify manipulation with sophisticated accuracy because he had practiced it systematically during our relationship, not because he had been subjected to it. My own life 5 years after Jake's successful career launch remained constrained by the criminal record I had accepted to protect his future. Employment opportunities were limited, social relationships were complicated by background check requirements, and professional advancement was blocked by felony conviction barriers that affected multiple aspects of daily life. The service industry work I had found after release from prison provided survival income, but no prospect for career development or financial security. The legal field where I had worked before my confession remained closed to applicants with criminal backgrounds, eliminating the professional path that had once provided both income and personal satisfaction. But the most profound consequence was the social isolation that resulted from Jake's narrative about our relationship becoming accepted truth among people who had known us both. Mutual friends, family members, and professional contacts had been influenced by his version of events to view me as someone whose judgment and character were fundamentally compromised. The few people who maintained relationships with me after Jake's campaign were those who had witnessed our dynamic closely enough to recognize the gap between his narrative and the reality they had observed. They could see that my sacrifice had been genuine rather than manipulative, that my imprisonment had been protection rather than consequences of personal failing. But even these supporters struggled with the cognitive dissonance between their direct observations and the professional validation of Jake's perspective. If medical colleagues and supervisors could see him as someone who had overcome toxic influences, and if he was recognized for character and integrity, then perhaps their memories were flawed or their understanding of our relationship was incomplete. The legal impossibility of challenging Jake's narrative without exposing both of us to perjury charges meant that his version of our relationship would remain unchallenged indefinitely. The truth about my sacrifice was permanently sealed by the same legal system that had accepted my confession as authentic. Dating remained virtually impossible because potential partners would eventually learn about my criminal record and the circumstances that led to it according to Jake's established narrative. Men who might overlook a vehicular assault conviction were understandably reluctant to become involved with someone who supposedly used criminal behavior to manipulate romantic relationships. The professional consequences extended beyond employment limitations to affect educational opportunities, professional licensing in various fields, and access to social programs that might have facilitated rebuilding my life after incarceration. The criminal record touched every aspect of existence in ways that created ongoing barriers to advancement. Jake's success as a surgeon was generating increasing recognition and professional opportunities that elevated his status within the medical community. Speaking engagements, research publications, and leadership positions were building a reputation that would provide lifelong career benefits and social standing. But every achievement Jake earned was built on the foundation of my destroyed prospects. Every recognition was enabled by the sacrifice I had made to protect his opportunity for success. The gap between our circumstances was a direct result of choices made to benefit him at my expense, but he presented his achievements as evidence of superior character and decision-making. The most devastating realization was that Jake's transformation into someone who could help others recognize and avoid toxic relationships was genuine professional development built on completely fabricated personal experience. His insights about manipulation tactics were accurate because he understood them intimately, but his understanding came from employing rather than experiencing them. Jake's role as mentor to younger medical professionals included advice about maintaining ethical standards and making wise personal choices that supported professional development. The irony of someone whose career had been saved through another person's unethical choice advising others about ethics was profound, but invisible to audiences who accepted his narrative. 5 years after our relationship ended, Jake had successfully transformed himself from someone who had been rescued through comprehensive sacrifice into someone who had escaped comprehensive manipulation. The woman who had gone to prison to protect his future had become the criminal influence he had wisely removed from his life. My genuine love had become his example of manipulation, my real sacrifice had become his evidence of toxicity, my authentic devotion had become his cautionary tale about people who would destroy others for personal gain. The protection I had provided had been reframed as the danger he had escaped. The hero who had saved someone's career through personal destruction had become the villain who had nearly destroyed that career through personal toxicity. Jake's success required not just forgetting my sacrifice, but actively remembering it as the opposite of what it had actually been. The medical students who looked up to Jake as a role model saw someone who had demonstrated wisdom and strength in difficult circumstances, someone whose character had been tested and proven through challenging personal experiences. They had no idea that his character had actually been protected from testing through someone else's comprehensive sacrifice. But perhaps most tragically, Jake's professional success was real and meaningful. He was genuinely helping patients and training the next generation of medical professionals. The career I had saved through sacrifice was being used for good purposes, even if the person whose career had been saved had proven unworthy of the salvation he had received. The woman who had taken the blame to protect him had become the blame he had overcome to achieve protection. My sacrifice had been transformed into his strength, my imprisonment had become his liberation, my love had become his lesson about avoiding people like me. I still have the letter Jake wrote to me during my 3rd month in prison, thanking me for my sacrifice and promising that he would spend his life proving worthy of the love I had shown him. The paper is worn from handling, the ink faded but still legible, evidence of promises that evaporated as soon as keeping them became inconvenient. Reading it now feels like examining artifacts from a relationship that existed only in my imagination. 7 years have passed since I was released from prison, and Jake's transformation from grateful beneficiary of my sacrifice to successful surgeon who overcame toxic influences in his past is now complete and professionally validated. The story he tells about our relationship has become so thoroughly accepted that even I sometimes wonder if my memories of events are accurate, or if I've constructed a false narrative to avoid accountability for behavior that was actually manipulative. But the facts remain unchanged regardless of how they've been reinterpreted. Jake was driving drunk when he hit the cyclist. I was at home 20 miles away when the accident occurred. I chose to confess to a crime I didn't commit to protect his medical career from consequences that would have ended it permanently. These are objective realities that no amount of revisionist storytelling can alter, even if they're now invisible to everyone who knows Jake's version of events. The most profound lesson from our relationship has been understanding how thoroughly someone can rewrite history when their success depends on forgetting what actually happened. Jake's career advancement required erasing my sacrifice from his personal narrative, transforming protective love into manipulative control, genuine devotion into calculated strategy for creating obligation and dependency. Jake's current status as department chief at the city's most prestigious hospital represents the pinnacle of achievement that my sacrifice made possible, but his success story now includes no reference to the protection that enabled it. He has become the sole author of his professional journey, someone whose character and determination overcame obstacles through individual strength rather than external rescue. The medical community's respect for Jake's leadership and clinical skills is genuine and deserved based on his professional competence and dedication to patient care. He has become an excellent surgeon whose work makes a meaningful difference in people's lives, validating every hope I had about the career I destroyed my life to protect. But the foundation of Jake's success remains the sacrifice I made to prevent drunk driving consequences that would have eliminated his opportunity to develop those skills or help those patients. Every life he saves as a surgeon was made possible by the life I sacrificed to protect his chance to save lives, a connection that has been completely erased from his personal and professional narrative. Jake's marriage to Dr. Sarah Chen has been featured in medical journals as an example of successful dual-physician relationships, with articles celebrating their shared commitment to advancing surgical techniques and training the next generation of medical professionals. Their partnership represents everything our relationship wasn't: mutual professional advancement, shared social status, complementary rather than conflicting life circumstances. Sarah's background perfectly complements Jake's professional aspirations in ways that my criminal record never could. Her prestigious medical education, research publications, and family connections in academic medicine enhance rather than threaten his reputation, providing social validation and professional networking opportunities that support continued advancement. The contrast between Sarah's contribution to Jake's career and my supposed detraction from it has become part of the narrative about his personal growth and improved judgment in relationships. His marriage is evidence of his ability to choose supportive partners rather than problematic ones, proof that he learned important lessons from his previous involvement with someone whose background created complications. But the most devastating aspect of Jake's success has been watching him become a mentor and role model for medical students and residents who see him as someone whose character was tested and proven through difficult personal experiences. His willingness to share lessons learned from his past relationship is viewed as generous professional development that helps others avoid similar challenges. According to former students who have described his mentoring approach, Jake emphasizes the importance of maintaining high standards in personal relationships, choosing partners whose values and character support professional goals rather than creating obstacles or complications. He speaks about learning to recognize manipulation tactics disguised as love or support, about the necessity of prioritizing career development over misguided loyalty to people who would ultimately hold you back. The presentations Jake gives about professional integrity and personal decision-making include warnings about people who use dramatic gestures or apparent sacrifices to create obligation and control in relationships. According to his analysis, truly supportive partners don't create situations where their love becomes a burden or their help becomes a trap for the person they claim to care about. Jake's expertise in recognizing these patterns is presented as hard-won wisdom from personal experience, insight gained through having been targeted by someone who used sophisticated manipulation tactics to create dependency and obligation. His ability to identify these behaviors is credited to his psychological sophistication and professional training rather than personal experience employing them. But the irony of Jake teaching others to recognize manipulation while describing tactics that he had actually used rather than experienced remains invisible to audiences who accept his narrative as factual. His understanding of how people create obligation through apparent sacrifice is accurate precisely because he had learned to exploit such sacrifice for his own benefit. My own life 7 years after protecting Jake's future remains constrained by the consequences of that protection in ways that create ongoing barriers to normal adult opportunities and relationships. The criminal record that saved his career continues to limit my employment options, housing applications, educational opportunities, and social connections. The service industry work that has provided survival income since my release offers no prospect for advancement or financial security, creating ongoing economic stress that affects every aspect of daily life. The legal profession that once provided both income and personal satisfaction remains closed to applicants with felony convictions, eliminating the career path that had defined my professional identity. But the professional consequences are less devastating than the social isolation that results from being unable to challenge Jake's narrative about our relationship without legal consequences that would destroy whatever life I've managed to rebuild. The truth about my sacrifice must remain permanently hidden to protect both of us from perjury charges that would result from revealing the actual circumstances of the accident. Dating has remained virtually impossible because potential partners eventually learn about my criminal background and the circumstances that led to it according to Jake's established story. Men who might overlook a vehicular assault conviction are understandably cautious about becoming involved with someone who supposedly uses criminal behavior and dramatic gestures to manipulate romantic relationships. The few serious relationships I've attempted have been affected by partners' awareness of allegations about my past behavior, with conversations about relationship dynamics often including implicit references to manipulation tactics that supposedly characterized my involvement with Jake. Normal relationship disagreements become suspect when viewed through the lens of my alleged history of using crisis and sacrifice to create control. My family's reaction to Jake's successful rewriting of our relationship history has evolved from supportive anger on my behalf to uncomfortable acceptance that challenging his narrative is both impossible and potentially harmful to my prospects for moving forward. They can see that defending me against his accusations only reinforces perceptions that I'm unable to accept responsibility for my actions. My sister Emma remains convinced that Jake is fundamentally dishonest and ungrateful, but she has stopped expressing these views publicly because doing so creates additional complications for my social and professional relationships. Even family support has become muted and private rather than vocal and protective. The isolation extends beyond romantic relationships to friendships, professional connections, and community involvement that might have provided social support and networking opportunities. Many forms of volunteer work, professional organizations, and social activities include background check requirements that eliminate people with criminal records regardless of circumstances. But perhaps the most profound consequence has been the psychological impact of living with the knowledge that someone whose life I saved has successfully convinced others that saving him was actually an attempt to destroy him. The cognitive dissonance between my memory of events and Jake's narrative has created ongoing uncertainty about my own perceptions and motivations. There are moments when I wonder if Jake's interpretation of my behavior contains elements of truth that I'm unable or unwilling to recognize. Perhaps my confession was partly motivated by desire for control rather than pure love. Perhaps my sacrifice did create obligation that felt manipulative rather than appreciative. Perhaps my protection was possessive rather than selfless. But these moments of self-doubt are countered by objective evidence that remains unchanged regardless of interpretation. Jake was driving drunk. I was at home. I chose to confess to protect his future. These facts exist independently of anyone's psychological analysis or narrative construction, providing anchor points for reality when revisionist storytelling becomes overwhelming. The therapeutic counseling I sought to process the relationship's aftermath helped clarify the difference between normal relationship dynamics and the systematic rewriting of history that Jake employed to avoid accountability for his ingratitude. Even relationships that include codependent or unhealthy elements don't typically involve complete inversion of cause and effect, victim and perpetrator, sacrifice and manipulation. My therapist's analysis suggested that Jake's transformation of our relationship narrative served multiple psychological functions that made it more appealing than acknowledging the reality of my genuine sacrifice. Casting me as manipulative allowed him to avoid examining his own character, justified his abandonment of someone who had loved him, and positioned his success as deserved rather than enabled. But understanding the psychological mechanisms behind Jake's behavior doesn't minimize its impact or make its consequences less real. His success in rewriting our history has created permanent barriers to my social and professional advancement while enhancing his own reputation and career prospects. 7 years after our relationship ended, Jake has achieved everything we hoped my sacrifice would make possible: prestigious position, professional recognition, social status, and marriage to someone whose background enhances rather than threatens his reputation. My protection accomplished its intended purpose, even if the person protected proved unworthy of protection. But the cost of that success has been the complete erasure of my role in making it possible, the transformation of my love into evidence of toxicity, my sacrifice into proof of manipulation, my genuine devotion into cautionary tale about people who would destroy others for personal gain. The woman who took the blame to protect him has become the blame he overcame to achieve success. My confession that saved his career has become his example of the criminal behavior he wisely avoided through superior judgment and character. My imprisonment that preserved his freedom has become his evidence of the toxic influences he courageously removed from his life. Jake's professional presentations about recognizing unhealthy relationships now include specific warnings about people who use dramatic gestures and apparent sacrifices to create obligation in romantic partnerships. According to his analysis, truly loving partners support your success without creating situations where their support becomes a burden or their love becomes a trap. The advice is technically accurate but cruelly ironic when delivered by someone whose success was enabled through exactly the kind of dramatic sacrifice he now warns others to recognize and avoid. Jake has become an expert on identifying manipulation tactics because he learned to exploit them, not because he experienced them. But perhaps the most devastating realization has been understanding that Jake's ingratitude and historical revision may have been inevitable given the nature of what I did for him. People who receive comprehensive rescue often resent their rescuers because being saved implies weakness, dependency, and inability to handle consequences independently. My sacrifice forced Jake to confront his own poor judgment, lack of character, and willingness to let someone else suffer for his mistakes. Living with that knowledge would have required ongoing gratitude and acknowledgement of dependency that threatened his self-image as someone who succeeded through individual merit rather than external protection. Rewriting our history to make me the manipulator rather than the martyr allowed Jake to maintain his self-concept as someone whose success was entirely deserved, while eliminating the cognitive dissonance that would have resulted from acknowledging that his achievements were built on someone else's destruction. The psychological comfort of viewing me as toxic rather than devoted, manipulative rather than sacrificial, solved multiple problems for Jake simultaneously. It justified his abandonment of our relationship, explained away his lack of gratitude, and positioned his success as evidence of wisdom rather than enabled privilege. 7 years later, I've learned to distinguish between helping someone and enabling someone, between protecting someone and teaching them that protection is available for irresponsible behavior, between love that requires accountability and love that accepts any behavior without consequences. The noble gesture I made to protect Jake's future taught him that consequences were transferable, that accountability was optional, and that other people's devotion could be exploited without reciprocal obligation. My sacrifice enabled someone whose character was fundamentally incompatible with gratitude or genuine partnership. But the most important lesson has been recognizing the difference between someone worth protecting and someone who demands protection. People who deserve rescue typically demonstrate gratitude, learn from their mistakes, and develop character that justifies the sacrifice made on their behalf. People who demand rescue often interpret help as weakness and resentment rescuers for witnessing their vulnerability. Jake belonged to the second category, someone whose character was revealed not by the mistake he made while drunk, but by his response to being protected from consequences of that mistake. His ingratitude, historical revision, and ultimate cruelty toward the person who saved his career demonstrated the kind of person he had always been beneath the charm and ambition. The truth about who someone really is emerges not during crisis when they need help, but after crisis when they no longer need help and must decide how to treat the person who provided it. Jake's treatment of me after his career was secure revealed everything important about his character and the value he placed on loyalty, gratitude, and love. The protector who was protected from exists now only in Jake's revised narrative as the toxic influence he overcame through superior judgment and character. But I know the truth about what happened, even if that truth must remain forever hidden to protect us both from legal consequences of revealing it. Sometimes the greatest sacrifice is not just taking blame for someone else's actions, but allowing them to blame you for the consequences of taking that blame. Jake's success required not just my confession, but my continued existence as the person whose toxicity justified his abandonment of someone who had loved him enough to destroy her own life for his benefit. I learned that some people's healing requires others to be designated as the source of their problems, that success sometimes demands villains who can be overcome rather than heroes who can be thanked. Jake needed me to be dangerous so he could feel safe with his ingratitude, needed me to be manipulative so he could feel justified in his cruelty. The woman who called me her protector eventually needed protection from the very person she had protected. But perhaps that transformation was inevitable once I taught someone that love meant absorbing consequences for behavior you didn't choose, that devotion meant sacrificing everything without expecting gratitude in return.